Welcome to a brief lecture on implicational laws in phonology. An implicational law of phonology is an observation about the frequency of speech sounds and sound combinations. In particular, certain sounds, natural classes, and sound combinations are more frequent across languages than others. Implicational laws state that if a less frequent sound, natural class, or another feature occurs in a given language, then corresponding more frequent sounds, classes, or features are also likely to occur, but not the other way around. In this lecture, we will discuss this concept in slightly more depth. Our objectives are to describe the patterns of sound frequencies and sound distributions, to provide a basic explanation of the role of sound frequency in language acquisition and in language change over time, and finally, to summarize implicational laws as a whole. Let's start by looking at the main premise of the implicational laws, frequencies and distributions. Some sounds exist in almost all languages. For example, three vowels, E, A, and U, or their very close variants, can be found in every language known today. All languages also have voiceless stops, such as P, T, K, or K, although not every language will necessarily have all voiceless stops possible. They also have at least one grooved fricative, such as S or Sh, at least one nasal sound, and at least one glottal or laryngeal fricative, such as H or H. On the other hand, some sounds are cross-linguistically rare, such as voiceless vowels, clicks, or pharyngeals. More frequent and less frequent sounds are organized in a kind of sound hierarchy. If a language has a less frequent sound, it also is going to have a more frequent counterpart of it. For example, nasal vowels such as on or ng or on are less common than oral vowels such as a or e or o. If a language has a nasal vowel, it is also going to have an oral one. French is one example of a language that has both oral and nasal vowels. This pattern is unidirectional. In other words, it works only in one direction. For example, the presence of an oral vowel does not indicate the presence of nasal vowels. English is an example of a language that has oral vowels, but no nasal vowels, at least not as phonemes. The pattern holds steady across most, but not necessarily all languages. For example, voiceless plosives are more common than voiced ones. This means that a language that has a B sound is likely to have a P sound, but a language that has a P sound may not have a B sound. But Arabic, for example, is an exception to this rule. Arabic has a voiced bilabial plosive B, but not the voiceless counterpart P. With respect to implicational laws, this means that having a less frequent sound implies that the language also has a more frequent sound, most of the time. Frequency and distribution also affect the acquisition of languages. We know, for instance, that children acquire stops before they acquire fricatives, and they acquire fricatives before they acquire affricates. So, at the beginning of acquisition, words like shoe can be pronounced as two, and words like lunch will be pronounced as lunts. We also know that languages that have affricates also have fricatives, but not the other way around. In other words, affricates imply fricatives, but fricatives do not imply affricates. We further know that languages that have fricatives also have stops, but not vice versa. In other words, fricatives imply stops, but stops do not imply fricatives. The upshot of this ostensibly complex patterning is that children acquire the sounds of their L1 in the order of frequency. Frequency and sound distributions also affect language change over time. Cross-linguistically less common sounds are more likely to disappear from any given language as the language changes diachronically. For example, back vowels are more likely to be rounded than unrounded. Front vowels are more likely to be unrounded than rounded. So, rounded front vowels occur less frequently than unrounded ones and are more likely to disappear from a language over the course of time. English is one case in point. Old English used to have the sounds U and U, but they merged with E and I by the Middle English period. It is important to know that the ease of articulation is somewhat, but far from 100%, is correlated with frequency of sound distribution. So, why do these patterns exist? Well, first, more frequently occurring sounds provide more input for sound analysis and sound-mouth mapping for babies. Therefore, they're acquired faster. Second, sounds with less laborious articulation, especially in different phonetic contexts, tend to persist in the situations of language contact and over time. If something is easier to articulate, it is less likely to be misarticulated or assimilated to other sounds. Third, sounds maximally distinct from other sounds tend to persist diachronically. So, with respect to English, for example, E and U are maximally distinct. While both are high, the first one is front and unrounded, and the second one is back and rounded. The sound U is too close to E in the frontness and height, but too close to U in roundedness. It occupies kind of a middle position between U and E. In the course of time, it merged with the sound closest to it in articulation, E, thus dropping out of the language. To sum up, some sounds are less frequent cross-linguistically than others. If a language has a less frequent sound, it also implies that it is likely to have a more frequent sound similar to the less frequent one. This is a basic premise of an implicational law. More frequent sounds are acquired first by babies and second language speakers too. More frequent sounds are less likely to disappear from a language over time. They're also less likely to disappear or to be erased, so to say, in situations of language contact. The frequency of sounds is somewhat correlated with ease of articulation, but not 100% of the time. There is no causative relationship between frequency and ease of articulation that we can empirically prove. And this is the basics of the concept of implicational laws in phonology.